The conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, and I remember thinking as I stood there alone at the far end of the table that the city looked beautiful from up here. Calm, indifferent. Nothing like what was happening inside that room. My father sat at the head of the table with his lawyers fanned out on either side of him like a wall. He looked at me the way he always had, like I was a minor inconvenience he'd never quite gotten around to resolving. Then he smiled. Not at me, at the room. "She thinks she has a case," he said, and the two men beside him laughed on cue. I didn't say anything. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and set my folder on the table. My hands weren't shaking. I'd spent 4 years making sure they wouldn't. I need to go back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. That's the part nobody talks about. How quietly a family can decide you don't matter. I was 26 when my mother died. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She went fast, and the grief was so sudden and total that for the first few months afterward, I could barely remember what day it was. I was working as a junior analyst at a commercial real estate firm downtown, eating sad desk lunches and sleeping badly, and I kept waiting for my father to call. Just to check in. Just to say her name. He didn't. What he did instead, 6 months after her funeral, was introduce us to her replacement. My stepmother walked into Sunday dinner at my father's house in Scottsdale carrying a bottle of Bordeaux she clearly hadn't chosen herself, and she smiled at me with her teeth, and I knew immediately that we were going to have a problem. Her name was Vivian. She was 41, which made her 3 years older than my father's company and 11 years younger than him. And she wore her hair in a way that required maintenance I couldn't afford. She had a daughter from her first marriage, Becca, 22, pretty and bored, and within 8 months of that dinner, the two of them had moved into my father's house in Scottsdale and started redecorating. My brother took it better than I did, or he pretended to. He was always better at pretending. I made the mistake, once, of telling my father how I felt. We were on the phone, and I said, carefully, that things were moving very fast and maybe we should all take some time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Audrey, your mother's been gone over a year. Life goes on." He used that phrase like it was a door he was closing. Life goes on. So I went on too, back to my apartment, my desk lunches, my work. The thing about commercial real estate is that you spend a lot of time learning how money moves. Not just numbers, the logic underneath them. Which assets are undervalued, which markets are about to shift, who owes what to whom and why. I was good at it. My boss, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patterson who never raised her voice, told me once that I had an instinct for the way a deal could turn. I held on to that comment for longer than was probably healthy. I started running the numbers on my father's company in my spare time, not to do anything with them, just because I understood that language and his business was one of the few places I could still feel close to him. He'd built Callaway Development from a small commercial contracting business into a regional property development firm worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million. He'd done it over 30 years, mostly through patience and a talent for buying land nobody else wanted and waiting. What I noticed, after a few months of quietly tracking public filings and industry reports, was that the company had started making decisions that didn't make sense. Over-leveraged acquisitions, a hotel project in Tempe that was bleeding cash, a new CFO, Vivian's brother's college roommate, who had no background in development. My father had always been conservative with risk. This wasn't him. Or it was him, but it was him filtered through someone else. I tried to bring it up once at a family dinner. My stepmother had made a comment about the Tempe project, something enthusiastic and vague, and I said carefully that the debt structure looked concerning based on what I'd read publicly. My father put down his fork. "You're an analyst," he said. "You analyze other people's deals. Leave mine alone." Becca looked at her manicure. My brother studied his plate. I left early that night and drove home with the windows down, even though it was February and cold, because I needed the air. That was the last dinner I attended for almost a year. During that year, I did 3 things. I got promoted, I started saving aggressively, Every dollar I didn't need went into a high-yield savings account and then, carefully, into a small private investment fund I'd set up with two colleagues from my firm. And I started having very quiet conversations with a woman named Sutton, who was a partner at a boutique advisory firm that specialized in distressed commercial real estate assets. I didn't tell anyone, not my brother, not my father. The Tempe Hotel project collapsed in April. It took two other Callaway assets down with it when the lender called the notes. My father lost $11 million in 90 days, and the company's credit rating dropped to a level that made new financing almost impossible to obtain. I heard about it from my brother, who called me on a Tuesday evening. His voice tight. "It's bad," he said. "He won't talk to me about it. But it's bad." "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "I've been watching." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I know," I said. "Don't worry about it." He didn't call back for 2 weeks. My father, for his part, did what people do when they've made catastrophic errors and can't face them squarely. He looked for someone to blame. And the person he landed on was me. I found out through a letter, an actual letter, certified mail, from a law firm I'd never heard of. It was 3 pages long, and it accused me of, among other things, improperly accessing confidential company records, sharing proprietary financial information with competitors, and contributing to the collapse of the Tempe project through deliberate interference. The letter requested that I preserve all communications and documents related to Callaway development and indicated that litigation was forthcoming. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I read it. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn. Then I called Sutton. "They're going to sue you," she said after I'd read her the relevant sections. "I know." "Do you have documentation of everything you did and didn't do?" "I have documentation of everything I've done for the past 2 years," I said. "I started keeping records the night of the Scottsdale dinner when he told me to leave his business alone." Another pause. "How thorough are we talking?" "Very." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, I need you to come in tomorrow. And Audrey, don't talk to your father." I hadn't planned to. The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later. My father sued me personally for damages totaling $3.2 million, alleging that my interference had directly caused the collapse of the Tempe project. His lead attorney was a man named Greaves, who had a reputation in Phoenix commercial litigation for being aggressive and expensive. The filing got picked up by a local business journal. My employer saw it. My manager, who was not Patterson, she'd retired the previous year, called me into his office and told me, with the careful language of someone who'd consulted HR, that they needed to place me on administrative leave while the matter was resolved. I cleaned out my desk on a Wednesday afternoon. A few colleagues stopped by. Most didn't. I drove home, sat in my car in the parking garage for about 15 minutes, then went upstairs and made coffee and opened my laptop. I had work to do. What nobody in my family knew, what nobody except Sutton and my 2 fund colleagues knew, was that 6 months earlier, I had quietly participated in the acquisition of Callaway Development's primary lender. Not as the lead, not in any visible way. My fund, pooled with 2 larger institutional partners Sutton had sourced, had purchased a controlling stake in the regional bank that held the majority of Callaway's outstanding debt. It was a legitimate distressed debt play. The bank was undervalued. The acquisition made financial sense completely independent of anything involving my father. But it meant that when the Tempe project collapsed and Callaway's notes came due, the entity that held that debt and therefore held substantial leverage over my father's company was, in part, mine. I hadn't planned it that way at the beginning, but I hadn't stopped it either. The morning of the court hearing, I put on the gray blazer I'd bought 3 months earlier. It was well made and quiet. Nothing that announced itself. I drove downtown, found parking, bought a coffee I didn't drink, and sat in my car until it was time. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the particular smell of a public building that has been cleaned too many times. My attorney, a woman named Pruitt who had been recommended by Sutton and who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke very precisely, was already there when I arrived. She nodded at me. I sat down beside her. My father came in a few minutes later with Greaves and two associates. He saw me and did something that took my breath away, even now. Even having expected it, he laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Turned to Greaves and said something I couldn't hear, and Greaves smiled. My stepmother was in the gallery. Becca was beside her. My brother was not there. The preliminary hearing was procedural, motions, scheduling, the judge asking clarifying questions. But my father couldn't help himself. When the judge asked whether the parties had attempted mediation, my father's attorney said they had not, and my father added, unprompted, "She doesn't have the resources for a protracted process, Your Honor. I expect this to resolve quickly." The judge looked at him. "Mr. Calloway, please let your counsel speak." But the damage, he thought, was done. He thought I would fold. He thought the loss of my job, the public filing, the weight of his name against mine would be enough. He had been thinking that since I was 26 years old, standing in his kitchen after my mother's funeral, waiting for him to ask how I was doing. Pruitt filed our response the following week. Attached to it were 4 exhibits. The first was a complete record of every public document I had reviewed related to Calloway Development, with timestamps. The second was a certified letter from my former employer confirming that I had not accessed any non-public information related to my father's company through my professional position. The third was an expert analysis from a commercial real estate economist concluding that the Tempe project's failure was attributable to structural over-leveraging and mismanagement, not external interference. The fourth was a disclosure document. I want to be careful here about what I say and how I say it, because the details are still partially subject to confidentiality, but the disclosure document outlined my fund's participation in the bank acquisition. It established that I was, as a matter of legal record, among the beneficial owners of the entity that held Calloway Development's restructured debt. Greaves received the filing on a Thursday. He called Pruitt that afternoon. I know because Pruitt called me immediately after and said, in her precise way, "He's asking for a meeting." "Of course he is," I said. The meeting was held in a conference room at Pruitt's firm. Greaves came alone. He sat down across from us and opened his portfolio and then closed it again without looking at anything inside. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, as if the words were being pulled out of him, "Is that really her? Is this the same girl?" Pruitt said, "I'm sorry." He shook his head slightly. "I've been in this business for 20 years, he said. "I don't." He stopped. Started again. "My client was not fully transparent with me about the nature of the opposing party's financial position." "No," Pruitt said pleasantly. "He wasn't." The case was settled 5 weeks later. My father's lawsuit against me was withdrawn with prejudice. As part of the broader debt restructuring that Calloway Development entered into, which our fund's participation made possible, my father retained a minority equity stake in the company he built. The operational control passed to a management team appointed through the restructuring process. He didn't lose everything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not built for that kind of ending, and I don't think it would have made me feel anything good. He kept the Scottsdale house. He kept his retirement accounts, which were personal assets unrelated to the business. He was 63 years old, and he had made terrible decisions and been poorly advised by people his wife had brought into his life. And the consequence was that the company he'd spent 30 years building was no longer his to control. I think about my mother sometimes when I'm driving at night. She would have hated all of this. She was a woman who kept her conflicts in small, sealed rooms inside herself and never let them spill. I don't know if that was wisdom or something else. My father called me 2 weeks after the settlement. I let it go to voicemail. He said, "I need to understand what happened." His voice sounded old in a way it hadn't before. "I don't understand how. I need you to help me understand." I listened to the message 3 times, then I deleted it. Not because I was still angry. I was past anger by then, or most of it. I deleted it because I didn't have an explanation to give him that he would be able to hear. The explanation would require him to understand how it felt to be told, at my mother's funeral, that life goes on. To sit at that dinner table with his new wife and her bottle of wine and feel myself disappear in real time. To receive a certified letter in the mail from a stranger accusing me of things I hadn't done, signed off on by my own father. He would have to understand all of that first. And some doors, once closed, stay that way. I went back to work. Sutton brought me on at her firm as a director of acquisitions, which was, I won't pretend otherwise, partly a gesture of goodwill and partly because I was good at my job and she knew it. The apartment I'd been renting for 4 years had a lease coming up. I didn't renew it. I bought a house in Tempe, of all places, small, near the water, with a yard that needed work. The first weekend I was there, I planted things. I don't know enough about gardening to tell you what exactly. Something that would eventually bloom. My brother called eventually. He said he'd been afraid to reach out. He said he hadn't known the lawsuit was coming until it was already filed, and that by then he didn't know what to do. I told him I understood, which was partially true. We got coffee. It was careful and a little formal, the way things are when you're rebuilding something after an earthquake. You keep testing the ground. My stepmother moved out of the Scottsdale house 8 months after the restructuring. The stories I heard second or third hand, so I don't know which parts to trust. What I do know is that she left before winter, and that my father was alone in that house for the first time in years. I think about what I would say to him if I ever had the conversation. If both of us were finally ready for it. I think I would say, I didn't plan most of it. I want him to know that. I was just paying attention, and I had learned how to use the tools I had. And when you handed a lawyer a letter that accused me of things I hadn't done, when you put your name on that, something in me went very still and very clear. I don't know if that's a lesson. I don't know if there's a moral that wraps this up neatly. What I know is that I stood in that conference room on the 42nd floor, alone at the far end of the table, and my hands didn't shake, and the city was beautiful through the windows, and for the first time in a long time, I felt exactly like myself. I keep coming back to the refrigerator humming. That's the detail that stays with me. I'm sitting at my kitchen table with a certified letter from my father's lawyers in my hands, and the refrigerator is humming, and someone outside is mowing a lawn, and the world is just continuing on like nothing happened. And I remember thinking, okay, what do I actually do now? I think that moment is where the real story lives. Not in the conference room on the 42nd floor, not in the settlement documents, not in Greaves closing his portfolio without looking at it. The story lives in that kitchen, in that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when I had every reason to fall apart, and instead I picked up the phone and called someone I trusted. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about getting through something hard. It's not one big decision. It's 100 small ones, made when you're tired and scared and not sure if you're doing any of it right. It's keeping records when you don't know yet that you'll need them. It's learning a skill, really learning it past the point where it's interesting and into the part where it's just work, because you love it, and because it matters and not because you can see exactly how it's going to save you. It's choosing again and again not to do the wrong thing even when the wrong thing would be easier. My father had all the advantages in that dispute: the name, the money, the attorney with the reputation, the narrative of the wronged patriarch. What he didn't have was an accurate picture of who I had become in the years he'd spent not paying attention. He sued the version of me that stood in his kitchen at 26 waiting for him to ask how I was doing. That person was real. But she'd had 4 years to grow into someone else. I don't think my father is a bad man. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether I believe that, and I do, mostly. I think he's a man who confused authority with understanding and who surrounded himself, eventually, with people who told him what he wanted to hear. But the Enns brothers' college roommate is CFO. A lawsuit filed without anyone stopping to ask what his daughter actually knew or had. Those aren't the choices of someone thinking clearly. They're the choices of someone who stopped questioning himself a long time ago. The thing about integrity, doing the right thing even when no one's watching, even when it costs you, is that it accumulates. I kept clean records not because I was planning a legal defense. I kept them because I didn't want to be someone who operated in the shadows, who cut corners, who let things be murky. That choice, made quietly and repeatedly over years, became the foundation of everything that followed in that conference room. And the discipline it took, getting up every morning during those years and doing the unglamorous work of learning and saving and building something real that wasn't glamorous either. There was no moment where it felt like a movie. It felt like spreadsheets and early mornings and explaining things to people who weren't sure yet whether to trust me. What I know now is that those three things held me: the commitment to doing things the right way, the intelligence to understand the landscape I was moving through, and the stubbornness to keep going when I had every reason to stop. Not because I was exceptional, because I refused to be someone who let what happened to her define what she became. The yard in Tempe still needs work, but things are starting to bloom.